In this video, I want to explain a real estate term because if you're a first-time home buyer, it's a term that you may not be familiar with, and that is contingent. So when a home goes under contract, a lot of people automatically assume that that home is going to close with that buyer and that seller. And if it was a contract without any contingencies, then that would be accurate. But most of our real estate contracts have a variety of contingencies in them. So just because a buyer and seller are under contract for a particular home, it doesn't necessarily mean that buyer and that seller are going to close on that home. And that's because of those contingencies. So the definition of contingency is basically contingent means certain events or conditions must occur for a real estate deal to move forward. And so what are some examples of some contingencies? So one of the most common ones is around the buyer's financing. The buyer may be pre-approved for a particular amount, but that doesn't mean that they're fully approved to purchase that particular home until the lender essentially says they are, and that has to go through underwriting. Both the buyer has to be approved and the lender has to agree with the value of the property and all of that. And so there's a lot that goes into that buyer financing contingency. And in all honesty, in almost every real estate contract, that contingency does exist, unless the buyer is purchasing with cash. Then you don't have a buyer financing contingency. But really, that's going to be the only exception. If it's financed, it's going to have a buyer financing contingency, typically. Another contingency that's pretty common in a real estate contract is an inspection contingency. So typically here in Florida, buyer has 10 days from the moment the contract is signed, and the signed contract is shared with both parties. So when it's executed, typically, and again, the inspection period is actually agreed to by the parties, but 10 days is pretty typical in our current market. So during that time, essentially the buyer can get out of the contract for any reason. It actually can be as simple as they just change their mind, although typically they do a home inspection and they find something in the inspection that they're concerned about as the potential new owner of the home. Maybe they ask the seller to repair it and the seller is unwilling to, and so then the buyer walks away. So that home sale was contingent on essentially the home passing inspections. And the third most common contingency is appraisal. And this ties into the buyer financing. Unless the buyer waives the appraisal contingency, then typically an appraisal contingency is going to be in place for the home buyer. And that means the home has to appraise at the contract price, essentially. If it doesn't, then the seller can either drop the price to the appraised value, the parties can decide to split a certain amount, or the buyer comes up with the difference basically out of cash, so he can't get a loan for that difference. And so that's a very common contingency. And then the last contingency that's common is a home sale contingency. So let's say the buyer is wanting to purchase a new home. Maybe they're upsizing. They've got a growing family, and so they need to sell their current home in order to purchase their future home. And so they would go under contract with a home sale contingency, essentially saying, we'll purchase your home, Mr. Seller, as long as our home sells. And then there's dates and whatnot that apply to the contingencies. So contingencies are essentially conditions that need to be met in order for the contract to actually go through. So I hope this information is helpful for you. As always, if you have any questions about real estate, please reach out to me. I'd love to help you. Remember, you can't miss with Chris. Thanks.